Tariffs.
Tariffs.
Reciprocal tariffs.
A lot of tariffs.
The most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff.
Since returning to office, President Donald Trump has imposed, expanded, suspended, and revised tariffs dozens of times across imports from China, Canada, Mexico, the European Union, and many other trading partners. In less than a year and a half, US tariff policy has been rewritten more than 50 times, creating one of the most dramatic shifts in American trade policy since the end of World War II. But how does a tariff actually work? And why has this single trade tool become the centerpiece of an entire presidency's economic strategy? A tariff is a tax on imports, paid by the importing company and collected by Customs and Border Protection at the point of entry. Here's a simpler explanation. A company in the US, let's call them Acme Appliances, places an order with a factory in Vietnam for 10,000 toaster ovens. The factory builds them and ships them via container to the port of Los Angeles. When that container arrives, a customs broker, a specialized logistics professional whose entire job is navigating this, files an entry with CBP. That filing includes something called an HTS code, the Harmonized Tariff Schedule Code, an enormously detailed, globally standardized classification system with thousands of categories. A toaster oven might fall under a completely different code and tariff rate than a convection oven, and the difference between those classifications can be worth millions of dollars to a large importer. Based on that HTS code, the country of origin, and the declared value of the goods, CBP calculates the duty owed. Acme pays it, often before the goods even leave the port through a bond system, and only then does the shipment get released into the supply chain. In 2025, the US federal government raised about $264 billion from these tariffs, with the actual average effective tariff rate increasing from 2.4% in 2024 to 7.7%, the highest level since 1947. To understand the scale of that number, $264 billion is larger than the annual budgets of many federal agencies, but tariff revenue still represented only a small fraction of total federal revenue, which exceeded $5 trillion. In other words, tariffs became a meaningful source of income. When a tariff is imposed, importers face three basic choices. They can either absorb the extra cost and accept lower profit margins, pass some or all of the cost on to consumers through higher prices, or restructure their supply chains by shifting production to countries with lower tariffs. In reality, most companies use a combination of all three strategies. The more competitive the market, the more likely firms are to absorb part of the cost themselves. The less competition there is, the easier it becomes to raise prices. If the importers choose to pass some or all of the cost on to consumers, this directly results in an increase in the price of these goods, making consumers pay more. Imagine Acme Appliances imported toaster ovens for $100 each and suddenly faced a 25% tariff. The landed cost rises to $125 before warehousing, marketing, or retail markup. If Acme previously sold the toaster for $149, maintaining the same profit margin might require raising the price to $179 or more. The United States Tax Policy Center estimates that tariffs announced through December 2025 will impose an average burden of about $1,050 per household in 2026. There's also a ripple effect if importers choose this method. While tariffs are levied predominantly on tangible imports, their incidence can fall on other commodities entirely. Particularly true for goods like aluminum that serve as inputs for domestic production. A tariff on imported steel doesn't just raise the price of imported steel, it raises the price of every American-made product that uses steel. Cars, appliances, construction materials, and soup cans, because domestic steel producers, facing less foreign competition, can raise their own prices too. This is sometimes called the umbrella effect, and it's one of the most underappreciated parts of tariff economics. The tax base is the import, but the price effect spreads across the entire domestic market for that good. This also makes tariffs difficult to analyze because large retailers like Walmart or Home Depot can sometimes pressure suppliers to lower prices. Suppliers can pressure factories, factories can pressure workers. By the time the tariff's impact works its way through the supply chain, the burden may be spread across half a dozen different participants in the transaction. Economists call this tariff incidence, and tracking who ultimately pays is far more complicated than simply identifying who wrote the check at the port. The importers can also choose to restructure their supply chains by shifting production to countries with lower tariffs. For instance, when the US raised tariffs sharply on Chinese goods, Mexico's exports to the US surged through 2025 as manufacturers, both Chinese and American, relocated final assembly operations across the border. A practice sometimes called tariff jumping, or, more cynically, rules of origin laundering. The mechanism is, if a product gets enough of its components, or enough substantial transformation, done in a country with a lower tariff rate or a free trade agreement, like Mexico under USMCA, it can legally qualify as a product of that country, even if most of its components originated elsewhere. So, you get a strange new map of global manufacturing emerging in real time. A circuit board made in Shenzhen, shipped to a maquiladora in Tijuana, assembled into a finished electronic device, then trucked across the border as a Mexican product. This is also why customs brokers and trade compliance lawyers have become some of the most in-demand professionals in global logistics. The difference between a product being classified one way versus another, under one HTS code versus a slightly different one, can mean a tariff rate of 2.5% versus 25%, or even 50%. This phenomenon also helps explain why trade deficits don't always shrink after tariffs are imposed. Imports from one country may fall dramatically, but imports from another country can rise just as quickly. The supply chain changes shape rather than disappearing altogether. What looks like a reduction in Chinese imports can sometimes be a rerouting of Chinese components through a different manufacturing hub. But aside from all this, what's even more surprising is that the US Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the power to set tariffs. Article 1, Section 8 is explicit about it. So how has one administration changed tariff rates more than 50 times without a single new law passing Congress? The answer is a patchwork of older statutes that delegate narrow, specific tariff powers to the executive branch. And the story of these past months is largely the story of which of these statutes gets used. The big one, used most aggressively in 2025, was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, a 1977 law originally designed for sanctioning hostile foreign regimes and freezing the assets of terrorists. It had never previously been used to impose tariffs. Through 2025, country-level tariff policy was driven primarily through IEEPA, which allowed the president to impose and adjust sweeping duties with minimal procedural constraint, with the administration applying across-the-board tariff surcharges on all trading partners by declaring successive national emergencies. Then, in February 2026, the Supreme Court curtailed the use for broad-based tariff actions, ruling, as multiple trackers describe it, that IEEPA does not authorize the president to impose tariffs at all, which invalidated the April 2025 Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs, as well as the fentanyl-related tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada. But the US government pivoted almost immediately to Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, issuing a global import surcharge at 10%, a provision designed for short-term balance of payments emergencies capped by law at 15% and a limited duration. In response to the ruling, the administration invoked Section 122 to impose a 10% across-the-board import surcharge on goods from nearly all countries for 150 days. Meanwhile, two other statutes kept running in the background the entire time and were never touched by the Supreme Court ruling. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the national security tariff used for steel, aluminum, copper, autos, and even pharmaceuticals, and Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, the unfair trade practices tariff historically used against China for intellectual property violations. But why would any administration lean on tariffs so heavily? It's worth understanding each one, because they're often used interchangeably, even though they point toward different goals. The oldest argument for tariffs is protecting domestic industry, dating back to Alexander Hamilton's infant industry arguments in the 1790s. Metals tariffs are designed to bolster the domestic manufacturing of strategic metals, ensure domestic producers and workers can compete on a level playing field, protect American jobs, and bolster American national security and public health. Under this lens, a tariff isn't a tax. It's a price floor that gives American factories breathing room against cheaper foreign competition. South Korea, Japan, and even the United States during parts of the 19th century used various forms of trade protection while developing key industries. The argument is that certain sectors, especially semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, steel, and defense-related manufacturing, may be too strategically important to leave entirely dependent on foreign supply chains. Another argument is the leverage in negotiations. This is where tariffs function less like economic policy and more like diplomatic pressure, a lever you can pull and release to extract concessions. The clearest example, in late 2025 and through 2026, the US administration secured new trade agreements and reciprocal tariff modifications with China, El Salvador, and other partners, often following periods of escalated tariff threats. The pattern is consistent: announce a severe tariff, watch the affected country come to the negotiating table, then announce a historic deal that often partially walks back the original threat. Whether the final deal represents a genuine improvement over the pre-tariff status quo or simply a return closer to it after inflicting mutual economic pain along the way is a matter of significant debate among economists. Argument 3 is revenue generation. With $264 billion collected in 2025 alone, tariffs have become a meaningful federal revenue stream, one that doesn't require a vote in Congress to adjust. Even after legal challenges forced the administration to revise parts of its tariff strategy, tariffs remained a significant revenue stream. By shifting between different statutory authorities and targeting different industries, the administration demonstrated how tariffs can serve not only as a tool of trade policy, but also as a flexible source of government revenue, all through delegated powers that allow many tariff changes to be made by presidential proclamation. Argument 4 is that tariffs are tools that don't need Congress. This is perhaps the least stated but most structurally important reason. Nearly every other major economic lever, tax rates, spending levels, regulatory frameworks, requires legislation, negotiation, committee votes, filibuster math. Tariffs, through these decades-old delegated authority statutes, can be raised, lowered, paused, or restructured unilaterally and immediately. Tariff policy has changed more than 50 times since January 2025, a pace of policy adjustment that would be utterly impossible through the normal legislative process. In an era of narrow congressional majorities and gridlock, a tool that bypasses that entirely has an obvious appeal, regardless of which party holds the White House. Critics argue this represents an unprecedented expansion of executive power over an area the Constitution explicitly assigns to Congress, which is, fundamentally, what the February 2026 Supreme Court case was about. Supporters argue that Congress delegated this authority decades ago precisely because trade conditions can change faster than the legislative calendar allows, and that the executive branch is simply using the tools it was given. What's not in dispute is the speed. Whatever you think of tariffs as policy, they are now one of the fastest moving levers in American economic governance. And that speed is, for this administration, very plausibly the entire point.